That is so soft and delicious. Hello, I'm Paul, and this is Paul Plays with Fire. Welcome. Today we're going to be making sourdough bread. Or should I say over the next couple days we're going to be making sourdough bread because it is a multi-day process. But don't let that scare you off. Stick around, it'll be fun. Like many people, I caught the sourdough bug during the pandemic. I got a starter from my niece. I kind of worked on my technique during that time, and now I can consistently make a pretty darn good country style loaf. During the winter, I probably average about 1 loaf a week. And that's just barely enough to stay competent at it. I'm never gonna be as good as somebody that makes 30 loaves a day. But right now, I'm talking to you, somebody that probably wants to make a loaf or 2 a week. And I'm gonna show you what I do and how I do it, and I can help you get there too. We should talk about terms and language a little bit. Sourdough, like many things, has its own set of language. I'm gonna be trying to use those terms as correctly as I can and pronounce them as correctly as I can, and then I'm going to define them along the way. So I hope that helps. Well, like I said, this is a multi-day process, so let's get busy. Okay, the first step in this process is to take some of our mother sourdough starter, which we keep in the fridge most of the time when it's not in use, because we're just not that active. We take some of this mother starter. She ain't pretty, but she does work. Take it out, make a leaven from it, which is taking a little bit of the starter, add in some fresh water and some fresh flour, mixing it up, let it sit for a couple days while we feed it. And then also, before we put this back in the fridge, feed it again, let it get good and bubbly, and make sure it's healthy before we put it back to sleep in the fridge. So we're gonna start by taking 100 grams of this starter. We're just gonna mix it all up here. 100 grams, and it doesn't take very much to make 100 grams. Okay, 100 grams of that, and then we're going to take 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of filtered water. Always use filtered water when you're making sourdough, because the chlorine in regular tap water will kill the yeast. It does a good job of killing bugs, chlorine does, but the bugs are what we want here. So now we're just going to mix that up a little bit. And that was 100 grams of the starter, 50 grams of flour, and 50 grams of filtered water. So in other words, 100% hydration. And we'll talk about hydration in a little bit. And we'll also talk about the kind of flour we're using in a little bit. For now, this gets us started on day one. Like I said, we're gonna feed our starter and let it bubble up a little bit, make sure it's good and healthy before we put it back in the fridge. And then we're just gonna mark it here so that we know how tall it is. And when it gets to about double in size, then we can stir it down and feed it again, probably sometime tomorrow. Okay, that's all for today. We'll see you tomorrow. Well, it's day 2, and we have a very active fermentation going on in both the leaven and our starter. That looks so much better than it did yesterday. Now that we all look better when we're well fed. And to be clear on what we did yesterday, we took 100 grams of starter out of here and put it into here to create a leaven. Then we took 50 grams of water, 50 grams of flour, added it to the starter in the leaven to give it something to chew on. Right after we did that, we took 50 grams of water, 50 grams of flour, added it to the starter to also feed it. That's why they both look so good right now, because they've both been well fed. Now we're gonna do the same thing all over again. We're gonna take another 50 grams of water and flour to feed it to this, and another 50 grams of water and flour to feed it to the starter. And after we feed the starter, we'll probably just put it right back in the fridge, because as it cools down, it'll eat a little bit, but it'll go into a much slower activity state in the fridge. And the feeding the leaven twice is a bit of overkill on my part, but it's because I abuse my poor starter by leaving it in the fridge for weeks at a time. I want to make sure before I make an investment of time in making bread that I have a good strong leaven, and feeding it twice, 2 days in a row ensures that. Let's talk a little bit about flour. You can use all-purpose flour, and that's the way I started, but what I use now is Robin Hood bread flour. I highly recommend it. It's wonderful stuff. And when I say that's what I use, that's partially true, because during the COVID, I kind of fell down a flour bread hole, a flour rabbit hole, and started blending flour. So now I use 60% of the white flour that I showed you, 30% of the white whole wheat flour. That gives us some extra character and texture. And then I use 10% rye flour. And that also gives it some very deep character that you don't get with just regular all-purpose flour. I also use that same blend to feed the starter and to feed the leaven, and I tell you, they love it. They really like that stuff. I mix up about 5 batches at a time, so that I don't have to mix it every time. It just makes it a little more convenient, and then I just use it out of that. And I tell you what, it makes a really good deep dish pizza too. You'll see that sometime between Christmas and New Year's. We're going to make Chicago deep dish pizza, and we use this flour to do it. So I'm looking forward to that. So let's get to feeding. We'll start with the leaven. We're just going to very simply and quickly add 50 grams of flour, 50 grams of water, and stir that up. And we'll make another line on the side so that we can gauge how our fermentation is going. And it actually did double from the line we drew yesterday, so that's a very good sign. Okay, and now for our starter, and we're gonna do the same thing, 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of filtered water. We did remove a little bit of starter before we added this time, because I wanted to make sure there was enough headroom and it didn't boil over on me. And then we'll just mix that up. And like I said, we'll put this one up in the cupboard till tomorrow. It's nice and warm up there above the oven. And then we'll put this one in the fridge. And that's it for today. See you tomorrow. Well, here we are, day 3 already, and I have a couple confessions to make. The first is that it's come to my attention that I've been mispronouncing the word Levain. I've been saying it Levain, and it's really Levain. So the concoction we make from our starter is pronounced Levain, I think. I'm going to try and do better going forward. The second confession is that I was planning on making bread yesterday. I didn't get it done. We just got too busy with other things. And in order to account for that, I simply fed the Levain for one more day. Just that simple. Gave it a little more flour, a little more water, put it back in the cupboard where it's just perfectly happy up there. Now it's nice and healthy and happy, and we're ready to go. So, we're going to get started making bread. Our basic recipe is 355 grams of flour, 255 grams of water, 150 grams of leaven, 10 grams of salt, and 15 grams of oil. Before we get started mixing the dough, let's talk about hydration percentage a little bit. I know I touched on that just a little bit yesterday. Hydration percentage, very simply, is the amount of water in the dough. Nice big round numbers. If you have 100 grams of flour and 70 grams of water, you have 70% hydration. Just that simple. Now, where it gets a little tricky is that when you're calculating your water and your flour in the dough, you have to take into account the water in the dough that's in the Levain. It's 150 grams, and it's half water, half flour, so 75 grams apiece. Just simply add those amounts into your flour and water when you're doing your hydration calculations. And that will give you a good, accurate number and give you something that's very repeatable. Why is hydration important? Well, you can make dough at 60% hydration, and it's nice and easy to work, but it won't be that big, fluffy, open, airy crumb that bakers so desire. In order to get that, you really need to be around 70. I like to work around 75%. That's a good compromise for me. It's a wet dough, but it's a workable dough. It's still manageable at that hydration level. Okay, enough about hydration levels. Let's make some dough. I use a Danish dough hook for mixing my dough because, especially with the higher hydration stuff, it just doesn't stick to this very well, so that works pretty good. And I've already measured out the flour into the bowl, and then we're going to take our salt and just sprinkle it around real good, and then just mix it up a little bit, just so that the salt gets distributed throughout the flour and we don't have any salt hot spots that would do damage to the yeast. Next, we'll mix in our wet ingredients, our about 95-degree filtered water. 95 degrees gets the dough a little on the warm side, and that helps it get going. and our olive oil, and our Levain. And we'll mix that up real good. Mix it up good enough that the water is absorbed into the flour, and the flour has absorbed the water, and it forms what's called a shaggy ball. That's another one of those baking terms for you. A shaggy ball is when all the flour or the water has been absorbed, and it's kind of one clump. It doesn't have to be a smooth clump or a neat clump or any of that. It just has to be kind of a smooth clump. I'll show you what, I'm almost there. Give me just a second. See how almost nothing sticks to that hook? Okay, there's our shaggy ball. So we're just gonna form that up a little bit into something that resembles a dough ball. And then we're gonna let that auto-lease, as another baking term for you. We're gonna let that auto-lease, meaning we're gonna let it sit and rest for about half an hour, 45 minutes, to absorb all the water into the flour. It's a process that's so special, they gave it a special name called auto-lease. I hope I'm pronouncing that one correctly. Well, anyway, we'll see you in about half an hour. Well, our dough has rested for a half an hour, and it has absorbed the water nicely, and it looks like it's ready to get going on to the next step, which is stretch and folds. This is where we stretch the dough periodically and fold it back in on itself in order to build strength in the glutens and to aerate the dough. Let's talk a little bit about working with high hydration dough. The tools I'm going to be using are a bench knife, a bench scraper, and my hands. And in order to keep the dough from sticking, because it's a high hydration dough, it gets pretty sticky. In order to keep it from sticking, we're going to be keeping our tools wet, which means my hands and the bench scraper. So first, let's start by releasing the dough from the pan. That looks really nice. After the rest and the absorbing, you can tell it's really working up into shape. It looks really good. So, working quickly and keeping your hand wet. I'd use a wet hand, dry hand. I just stretch the dough and then fold it back on itself. Wet the hand, stretch the dough, fold it back on itself. Wet the hand, stretch the dough, fold it back on itself, and one last one. Wet the hand, fold the dough. You can tell it's already developing some resistance to it, but it's tearing a little bit, so we're gonna quit there. Okay, we'll do that 2 or 3 more times after this with a half an hour rest each time. Well, it's been another 30 minutes, and it's time for our next set of stretch and folds. Once again, working with wet tools, wet hand and a wet dough scraper. I found out this is called a dough scraper. The metal one is called a bench scraper. I have one of those too, you'll see it in a little bit. So we're just gonna release our dough. That looks and smells like it's really coming along nicely. It looks very good. Got our dough released. Then just stretch it, bring it back. Stretch it, bring it back on itself. And notice with my nice wet hands, I'm hardly picking up any dough. Stretch it. Being patient, using all the patience you can muster. Okay, that's coming along nicely. At least one more, maybe 2 more. Now it's time for our third and probably final stretch and fold. We're gonna take our dough scraper, just release it from the mixing bowl. Look how clean that stays, that's very impressive. The magic of wet, and then our stretch and folds. And the fourth, stretch and fold. Starting to get pretty elastic. This never works for me, but I'm going to try it anyway. A window pane test. That's pretty good. That is really good. I think we're ready for bulk ferment. Okay, we're gonna let it bulk ferment for an hour and a half or 2 hours until it about doubles in volume. As a matter of fact, until it about exactly doubles in volume. So we'll see you then. Okay then, well, we've got enough of a bulk rise out of our dough that I'm happy with it. Bulk rise is a little bit tricky. You got to make sure that you get enough of a rise that you get a good puffiness to the dough, but you can go too far. If it gets a little bit over risen or a little bit overproofed, I think is what they call it, then the dough just kind of tends to flatten out when you go to bake it, because it loses all its consistency or all its elasticity, I believe they call it. So anyway, we've got our proof dough. It looks pretty good. I've already cut it loose with the dough scraper. So I think it's ready to go. We're gonna put down a little bit of flour, not a lot. So what we're making now is the top of the bread. What we're gonna put flour side down is gonna be the top of the bread. There we go. So now what we're gonna do is we're gonna pre-shape this just for a little bit, just to get a nice roundish shape to it. And then we're gonna kind of get it to come out a little bit. Now the top is sticky, but the bottom is not, because it's got the flour down there. So we're gonna bring it out like this, stretch it out, but being gentle with it, because we don't want to pop all the bubbles that we work so hard for. And then fold it over on itself, fold it over on itself again. Oh, I should mention, I have a Bandenton, or a proofing basket, that I have put rice flour in, so that we have some place to put this thing when we get done with it, because we're almost there. Come on, don't fail me now. Pretty close. That will work. That will work. That was not perfect, but that will work. It's mostly downside down, and we just got the little bits to stitch up, and we're gonna call that good. So we are done for today. We're gonna put a bag on this. We're gonna put it in the fridge, and tomorrow we bake bread. See you tomorrow. Okay, here it is, day 4, finally to baking day. And this is the easiest day, it's the funnest day for sure, because we get to see the results of our work. But there is some risk involved. We gotta handle this big, heavy cast iron pan after it's been heated to 450 degrees, so there's that. And we also have to have a little bit of fear back there that you just wasted 4 days of your life making a loaf of bread that just didn't work out for some stupid reason. Here's our loaf, it's looking really good. We're gonna take that loaf, we're gonna put it on this piece of parchment paper, and then we're gonna lower that into our Dutch oven. If you've watched the show before, I'm sure you've probably seen our Dutch oven before. It's one of my favorite tools, and I use it all the time. Why do we cook inside a Dutch oven? Well, 2 reasons. One is temperature control. Once we preheat this to 450, it holds its heat really, really well. Then the other reason is humidity control. Once we put the loaf inside with the lid on, all the steam that escapes from the loaf stays inside here and helps keep the crust moist for the first 20 minutes. That helps with oven spring. If the crust gets dried out too quickly, if it's cooked in an open oven, then the oven spring gets trapped inside the loaf, because the loaf cooks before it has time to spring. So keep cooking it inside a Dutch oven, works really well. I've had really good success with it. Oh yeah, oven spring. There's another one of those baking terms. Oven spring is the rise that the bread gets while it's in the oven. It springs up, if you will. Well, we're gonna preheat the oven to 450 degrees, like I said, with the Dutch oven inside. Then we're gonna put the bread in, cook it for 20 minutes at 450 degrees with the lid on, and then we're gonna take it out, take the lid off, put it back in the oven for another 20 minutes at 425 degrees. And then we're done, it's just that simple. So enough talking, let's get busy. Okay, we're back. The oven's preheating. It's about to get really exciting around here, so stick around. We're gonna take our bread, got our bread here, take our bread, turn it out onto this crudely cut piece of parchment paper. Just like that. Oh, look at that, isn't that beautiful? Dust it with a little rice flour, just to make it look pretty. It doesn't really affect the flavor, the texture, or anything, but it does affect the appearance. So yeah, it's worth doing. And then we're taking our bread lahm, which is French for blade. Lahm is French for blade. We're gonna take our bread lahm and score it, make a functional score over here. That gives it, when the oven spring happens, the bread's gonna crack somewhere. By giving it a score, we just tell it where to crack. We're gonna make a functional score over here, and then we're gonna make some pretty little cuts that look like a stalk of wheat. So here we go. Functional score, very carefully. That's perfect. And then 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. There, look at that. Isn't that pretty? Wait till you see it out of the oven. Okay, now we're gonna move that to the side. And very carefully, gotta get our ducks in a row here. Oh, take our very heavy, very hot Dutch oven out. Oh, pick that off. There we go. So far, so good. Lower that right in there. Take a couple ice cubes, put it around the edge to provide a little extra steam along the way. That's not where you go. Go over here. Okay. And then, without panicking, one of these, my biggest fear is one of these days I'm going to reach down and pick up this lid with no protection. I hope I have a camera on when it happens. And then put it back in the oven. $450 for 20 minutes. See you in 20 minutes. Well, bread's been in for 20 minutes, and although it still has 20 minutes left to cook, this is, to me, the moment of truth. We're gonna pull the bread out, pull the lid off, and we get a peek at how we did. I'd say we did pretty good. Look at that. I'm very happy. Excellent, excellent, excellent. Okay, now it goes back in the oven. Look at that ear. The ear is the cut edge along the top that rises up and turns crispy. We'll look at that in another 20 minutes. For now, back in the oven. And we'll turn the heat down to 425, and then we'll see you in 20 minutes. Okay, it's been 40 minutes, and it's time for the bread to come out. We'll see how we did. Oh, look at that. I am very happy. Isn't that a thing of beauty? Now we'll see if we can get that out of there without burning our little fingers. It's funny how paper does not hold heat the way cast iron does. I can touch paper as soon as it comes out of the oven. Cast iron, on the other hand, if I touched it right now, it would hurt. So we'll set that out of the way. Get this off the parchment paper, and then just marvel. Just look at that, isn't it beautiful? Our functional score, you can see the oven spring, and then this part up here, this burnt top that rises up from the functional score is called the ear, and that's a prized piece. And then we've got our decorative score. You see our little wheat leaves right here, and the rice flour that we use to rub it a little bit makes those scores really pop. So, we'll have to let that cool for a little bit, and then we'll cut it open and see how we did. I'm sure it's going to be delicious. Okay, here we go. Moment of truth again. We're going to cut into this bread and see what we got. So let's give it a try. Oh. There we go. Oh, look at that. That's a pretty nice crumb. That's not the biggest crumb I've ever had, but that's still pretty nice. Try and exaggerate it a little bit. Well, let's cut off a piece and give it a taste. That is so soft and delicious. Oh, and the complexities of the sourdough and the rye flour. That is so good. Boy, that is good. Wow. I tell you what, that's well worth the effort, no matter how long it takes. I'm so glad you tuned in today, and I hope we all learned something here today. We had a good time, we had fun, we made some really good bread, and so I hope you consider subscribing, because I wouldn't want you to miss any future episodes. We've got sourdough pizza coming up. I mean, excuse me, just regular deep dish pizza coming up, and that's gonna be another great episode. So this has been Paul Plays with Fire. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye.